Problems always landed with me. Not because I caused them. Not because I volunteered. They just arrived. Quietly handed over. Casually placed in my hands like something I was already expected to carry. And I did. For a long time. Longer than I should have. I didn't notice when it started. That's the dangerous part. Roles like this never begin with an announcement. They form slowly, through patterns that feel harmless at first. Someone avoids a difficult conversation because I'll handle it. Someone makes a mistake because I'll clean it up. Someone explodes emotionally because I'll absorb it and smooth things over afterward. I became the place where consequences went to disappear. At first, it felt like strength. I told myself I was dependable, mature, emotionally stable. I could handle pressure without falling apart, so why shouldn't I? I was good at staying calm when others panicked. Good at taking blame without defending myself. Good at listening while being misunderstood. People praised that part of me. They called me grounded, balanced, safe. What they didn't call it was what it really was. They didn't call it extraction. Because every time tension built up somewhere else, it was redirected toward me. Every time accountability threatened to surface, it detoured. I was the buffer, the shock absorber, the thing that made everyone else's lives smoother by taking the hit they didn't want to feel. And the strange thing is, no one explicitly asked me to do it. That's how this role survives. It doesn't need permission. It just needs compliance. And I gave that freely because I thought that's what being strong meant. I learned early how to minimize myself, how to swallow reactions before they reached my face, how to translate other people's messes into something manageable. I became fluent in emotional damage control. I could sense tension before it exploded, anticipate blame before it landed, intercept conflict before it spread. People leaned on that without even realizing they were leaning. And every time I stepped in, something small disappeared inside me. Not dramatically. Not in a way that raised alarms. Just a quiet erosion. A tightening in my chest. A fatigue that didn't go away after rest. A growing sense that my inner life existed mainly to stabilize everyone else's. Still, I kept going. Because the alternative felt selfish. If I didn't absorb it, someone else would suffer. If I didn't take responsibility, things would fall apart. That's the logic that traps you. You become essential by making yourself expendable. There were moments I almost noticed. Moments where I felt a flicker of resentment rise, only to push it back down. Moments where I wondered why I was always the one apologizing, explaining, fixing. But I silenced those thoughts quickly. I didn't want to be difficult. I didn't want to disrupt the balance I had created. What I didn't realize was that the balance only existed because I was underneath it holding the weight. The first real crack didn't come from anger. It came from exhaustion. A deep, bone-level tiredness that sleep couldn't touch. I remember standing still one day, listening to someone unload their latest crisis onto me, and realizing I felt nothing.
No empecé surge.
No problem-solving instinct. Just a hollow space where my reflexes used to be. That scared me more than pain ever had. Because pain at least means something is wrong. Numbness means something has adapted. I started noticing patterns I had ignored for years. How people relaxed after handing things to me. How accountability vanished once I stepped in. How conflict magically resolved itself the moment I absorbed the blame. I noticed how rarely anyone asked how much it cost me. How normal it felt to them that I would just take it. And that's when the thought appeared. Quiet. Unimpressive. Almost accidental. What would happen if I didn't?
I didn't act on it yet.
I wasn't brave enough for that. But the question stayed.
It followed me.
It changed how I listened, how I responded, how I interpreted every interaction. I began to see my role not as a virtue, but as a system. A system that worked perfectly for everyone except me. And systems don't collapse all at once. They collapse when one piece stops doing its job. By the end of that period, something had shifted inside me. Not outwardly. Nothing dramatic had happened.
No confrontations. No declarations.
Just a growing awareness that I was standing between people and the consequences of their own behavior. And I was very, very tired of standing there. I didn't know yet what I was going to do. But for the first time, I understood that continuing like this would cost me something I wouldn't get back. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. The exhaustion didn't make me collapse. That would have been easier to explain. Instead, it sharpened me. I started paying attention in a way I never had before, not just to what people said, but to what they expected without saying it. I noticed how conversations curved toward me when things got uncomfortable, how eyes subtly shifted in my direction when tension rose, how silence would stretch until I filled it, smoothing, reassuring, fixing. They weren't demanding it outright. They didn't have to. I had trained them well. So, I began doing something small, almost invisible. I paused. Not dramatically. Not long enough to alarm anyone. Just long enough to feel the space where my usual response would go. And in that space, something interesting happened. People became uneasy. They filled the gap with nervous explanations. They repeated themselves. They waited. They were waiting for me to absorb it. That's when I realized how automatic the arrangement had become. My presence alone had turned into a guarantee. A safety net they never checked for wear and tear. They assumed I would always be there, always steady, always willing to take the hit, so they wouldn't have to. And I still did, sometimes. Old habits don't vanish overnight. But each time I stepped in, it felt heavier. More deliberate. Less noble. I could feel the cost now, and that made it impossible to pretend it was free. The internal pressure started to build. Not outward anger, but something tighter and more controlled. A sense of being cornered by expectations I never agreed to, yet somehow upheld. I began to see how my silence had been interpreted as consent, how my endurance had been mistaken for limitless capacity. The turning point wasn't explosive. It never is. It was a moment of clarity, so calm it almost felt disappointing. I was listening to another familiar situation unfold. Blame drifting toward me. Responsibility quietly sliding into my hands. And suddenly I saw the full picture at once. Not just this moment, but all of them layered together. Years of intercepted consequences. Years of emotional labor disguised as loyalty. And I understood something uncomfortable. They didn't need me to suffer. They just needed me to prevent them from feeling it. That distinction changed everything. Because once you see that, the story that kept you compliant starts to fall apart. I wasn't protecting people out of love alone. I was preserving their comfort at the expense of my own stability. I was cushioning their mistakes, so they never had to fully register the impact. I went quiet after that. Not withdrawn. Not cold. Just selective. I stopped rushing in. Stopped volunteering explanations. Stopped absorbing emotions that weren't mine to carry. I didn't announce this shift. I didn't frame it as a boundary. I simply wasn't there in the same way. The reactions were subtle at first. Confusion. Slight irritation. A sense that something wasn't working like it used to. People repeated themselves more. They escalated emotionally, as if volume could restore the old pattern. I watched all of this with a strange detachment, like observing a mechanism misfire. And then came the pressure. Not direct confrontation. That would have required accountability. Instead, it showed up as disappointment. As hints that I was different. Less supportive. Less present. The implication was clear. My role was to absorb. And by not doing that, I was breaking an unspoken contract. That's when the guilt hit hardest. The old conditioning surged back. The urge to step in, to fix, to restore balance. I almost did. Several times. It would have been so easy to slide back into the familiar shape they preferred. But something in me refused. Not out of spite. Out of self-preservation. I didn't want revenge. I didn't want to teach anyone a lesson. I just wanted to stop bleeding quietly while everyone else stayed clean. So I held the line, even when it felt uncomfortable. Even when silence stretched longer than I liked. And that's when things started to fall apart. Not catastrophically. Not all at once. But in small, revealing ways. Issues that used to resolve themselves suddenly lingered. Conflicts escalated instead of dissolving. Emotions bounced around without a place to land. For the first time, they were feeling what I had been intercepting. And they didn't like it. The shift became impossible to ignore when the consequences stopped being abstract. Without me smoothing things over, patterns were exposed. Words landed where they were originally aimed. Actions produced reactions that couldn't be redirected. The buffer was gone. At first, there was denial, an assumption that this was temporary, that I would eventually step back into place. People tested the edges, pushing situations toward me the way they always had, expecting the familiar absorption. When it didn't happen, frustration replaced confusion. That frustration turned outward quickly. I was accused of being distant, of changing,
Of not caring the way I used to.
It was fascinating how easily my refusal to suffer quietly was reframed as a moral failure. The story adjusted itself to protect the system. If I wasn't absorbing damage, then I must be the problem. And for a moment, I almost believed it. Old reflexes are powerful. They don't disappear just because you see them. They argue back. They remind you of all the times you kept things from collapsing, all the times you held people together. They whisper that if you don't step in now, everything will unravel and it will be your fault. But I watched closely, and something important became clear. Things didn't unravel because I stepped aside. They unraveled because they had been held together by avoidance. Without my intervention, people were forced to face dynamics they had ignored. Tensions that had been deferred now demanded attention. Accountability that had been softened now arrived unfiltered. The discomfort they were experiencing wasn't new. It was overdue. And that's when the power shifted. Not because I confronted anyone, not because I exposed anything publicly, but because I was no longer the place where consequences disappeared. By removing myself from that role, I changed the entire emotional economy. Pain no longer had a designated recipient. The reactions intensified. Some tried to pull me back in with guilt, others with nostalgia, a few with subtle threats of withdrawal. They missed the version of me that made their lives easier, and they wanted it back.
I didn't argue.
I didn't defend myself. I just stayed where I was. And that silence did something no explanation ever could. It forced people to sit with their own discomfort, to experience the friction they had outsourced, to feel the weight they had grown accustomed to handing off. Not everyone learned from it. Some grew resentful. Some blamed me more openly. But a few changed. I could see it in how they hesitated before acting, how they considered consequences they used to ignore. They were adjusting to a world without a buffer. For me, the change was quieter but deeper. Without constantly managing everyone else's emotional fallout, I had space. Space to feel what I had postponed. Space to notice how much of myself had been organized around being useful rather than being whole. There was grief in that realization. Grief for the years spent shrinking myself. Grief for the belief that my worth was tied to how much damage I could absorb without breaking. I let myself feel that grief instead of redirecting it. And something unexpected happened. I felt lighter. Not because everything was resolved. Not because relationships magically improved, but because I was no longer betraying myself in the name of harmony. The calm I felt wasn't forced. It wasn't the calm of suppression. It was the calm of alignment. The power reversal wasn't dramatic. There was no moment of triumph. Just a quiet rebalancing. People who relied on me to absorb their messes lost that advantage. And I gained something far more valuable. Agency. In the aftermath, the landscape looked different. Some connections weakened. A few disappeared entirely. They couldn't survive without the dynamic that kept them comfortable. That used to scare me. Now it felt honest. Other relationships shifted. Not perfectly. Not without tension. But they became more real. Less dependent on my self-erasure. I was no longer the invisible infrastructure holding everything up. I was just a person among other people, with limits that mattered. I learned something important during that time. Being the shock absorber doesn't make you indispensable. It makes you invisible. People don't protect what they don't have to notice. They assume it will always be there, quietly doing its job. Until it isn't. Letting others experience the full impact of their actions wasn't cruelty. It was clarity. It revealed which connections were built on mutual responsibility and which were built on silent sacrifice. And once you see that, you can choose differently. I don't absorb damage anymore. Not automatically. Not silently. I still care. I still support. But I don't intercept consequences that don't belong to me. I don't disappear to keep others comfortable. The strange thing is, the world didn't end. People adapted. Or they didn't. Either way, I survived. More than that, I reclaimed parts of myself I didn't realize I had given away. If you've ever been the one who takes the hit so everyone else can keep moving, you already know how this feels. The question isn't whether you can keep absorbing the damage. It's whether protecting others is worth destroying yourself.